Welcome to ADAA's webinar, Social Anxiety in Teens and How to Treat It. I'd like to introduce our speaker, Dr. Jacqueline Sperling, a clinical psychologist and faculty at Harvard Medical School, who is also the author of the young adult nonfiction book, Find Your Fears: How to Put Social Anxiety in Its Place. Thank you so much for joining us today, Dr. Sperling.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction. I'm Dr. Jackie Sperling, and today we'll be talking about social anxiety in teens and how to treat it. Before we get started, I just have disclosure where I'm the author of the book, Find Your Fears: How to Put Social Anxiety in Its Place. It's a book for young adults, teens with social anxiety, and it's published by American Psychological Association's Imagination Press. Okay, so what are we going to cover today? We're going to talk about what is social anxiety and what's the treatment for it. So, as humans, typically wired to connect, and it's very common to care about what others think of us. And if you're a teenager, it's even more common because your peers become even more important to you. Social anxiety takes that caring to a whole other level, and you start to worry about being judged or embarrassed, especially around people around your own age, not just adults. And it starts to get in the way of social experiences, school experiences, family gatherings, and it's going on for at least 6 months. Has been going on for at least 6 months. And sometimes there's a specific focus on performing, whether it's giving speeches or getting on a stage. And some people find that actually they can perform on stage. Just for them, it's being a character. It's other experiences that get in the way for them are really challenging. We'll talk about examples shortly. If you're experiencing this, you're definitely not alone. It's really common. So anxiety disorders are the most common mental illness, and social anxiety is the second most common anxiety disorder next to specific phobia. So if there are about 400 people in your school, think about there are about 36 people who are also experiencing social anxiety. So you're definitely not alone. So how does it show up? These are just examples. It's not an exhaustive list. So some people find that they have difficulty eating in front of others. Lunchtime often is a difficult experience for students at school. Some people worry about making a mess, having food in their teeth, making noises while they eat. Using public restrooms can be really tricky. Ordering at restaurants, talking to people, being on the spot. Participating in class, and this can look a variety of different ways. Some people have difficulty participating no matter what. Some people have difficulty participating if they don't know the answer with 100% certainty. There's a range. Also participating in extracurricular activities, and that can be performance-based or for any reasons. It could also be, we'll get to physical activity, those challenges too. There can also be challenges speaking in front of groups, talk about presentations or performing, but it also can be when you're in front of just multiple people, like at birthday parties as well, that can be tough. And exercising in front of others, this is what I was referring to with extracurricular activities that involve physical activity, and that can be performance-based. It also can be people worrying about showing any physiological signs of anxiety, like flushing, sweating, and people will struggle with that. So again, this is not the only list of how it might show up. There's a variety of different ways. Just wanted to give some examples. So we're talking about how it can get in the way. Let's talk about what you can do about it, because there is something you can do about it. The treatment is cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT, with exposure and response prevention, ERP. It's like alphabet soup. And it's well established, meaning research has shown that it can be helpful. It's the gold standard, go-to treatment. Let's talk about what it involves. So the CBT aspect is based on this core foundational model, this 3-component model. You can see there are 3 bubbles here. And cognitive behavioral therapy, so cognitive thoughts, behavioral, you got behaviors, and therapy talks about feelings. And you notice that they're connected with arrows that go both ways. So it doesn't just start with a thought and then go to a feeling and then go to behavior. And so you can have a behavior and then it have a certain thought and then you feel a certain way. So they're all connected with each other. And CBT teaches you tools to maybe address 1 bubble at a time, 2 bubbles at a time, 3 bubbles at a time, so that you can manage your thoughts, feelings, and behaviors and do the things that are important to you. So what might this look like? And there's a variety of different tools that you'll learn in CBT should you choose to pursue it. One might be to how to manage your thoughts, and then in turn, that might help you manage your feelings and behaviors. So say you're walking down the school hallway, your best friend bumps into your shoulder, doesn't say anything, and keeps walking. What's one thought you could have? She must be mad at me. And then how might you feel? I'm kind of worried. What am I going to do? And then at lunch, she's mad at me. I'm not going to sit with her at lunch. And then what does the friend think? Well, she must be mad at me. If she's not going to talk to me, I'm not going to talk to her. And all of a sudden, the friends aren't talking. Let's rewind and go back to that hallway. Walking down that hallway, best friend bumps into you, doesn't say anything, and keeps walking. What's another thought that you can have? Maybe she just didn't see me, maybe she was late to class. How might you feel? Calm, neutral. Want to do at lunch? Well, sit next to her and see what was going on, see how her day was going. So what was different? Did the best friend bump into the person less hard the second time? No. Situation was exactly the same. It was how you thought about it that was different. And then all of a sudden, you're sitting with your friend at lunch, or you're not sitting with your friend at lunch. So that's one blip in your day and a tool that you can use to help manage your thoughts and think about other ways of perceiving situations so that you can help keep your feelings and behaviors in check. Now, for any of you who are in 7th grade or been through 7th grade, you know very well that your best friend can be mad at you in a drop of a dime, right? That can happen. The thing is, how helpful will it be for you to stew on that worry, like, oh, she must be mad at me, on your way to math class when you don't have a chance to check in with her right away. So there also will be tools that you can learn in CBT, like how do you stay focused in the present moment when you need to, and then you can then learn how to go, talk with your friend, check in afterward to see if there really was something that you did to make her mad at you, and apologize if necessary. So there will be tools that you can use in CBT. So, and not just the ones that address your thoughts. This is just an example. There's a special type of CBT, exposure response prevention, ERP, that I mentioned, that helps you gradually, step by step, approach the things that have been challenging for you without using typical avoidance or safety behaviors. We call them safety behaviors because they keep your anxiety safe, and without sort of like getting to the back seat and stay safe in the driver's seat for you, and not keeping you safe. And then maybe thinking, why would I want to do that? Well, hear me out. So think of a swimming pool, not on a hot summer day, like on a cool, chilly day, like high 60s for Fahrenheit. And you're like, hey, why don't you jump in the deep end? Nope. All right. What if you dip your big toe in the shallow end? I think, well, okay. And how might it feel at first? A little chilly. All right. After like 15 minutes, what happens? Well, kind of got used to it, realized I could do it. Yeah. So what happens when you dip your next toe in? Same thing. All right. Up to your ankles, up to your knees, up to your waist, up to your neck. And I say, hey, what about dunking your head now? And I think, all right. Because why? Well, the whole rest of my body is wet and I'm okay in the water. Or I can dunk my head. That's right. You could have gotten your whole body wet by jumping in the deep end. But that would have been a shock to your system, most likely. So in ERP, don't start with the deep end, you start with your big toe. And you're the expert on what your big toe is. No one forces you to do anything. You work together as a team with a mental health clinician, gradually, step by step, approaching your fears. And you'll come up with a plan of the things that you fear the least and the things that you fear the most, making a ladder, so to speak, where each step is something that you fear. And if you think of a ladder leaning against an office door and you start knocking off the bottom rungs of the ladder, what happens to the height? The top of the ladder is no longer as tall. So the thing you fear the most is no longer as far away. It's more approachable. It's like that deep end of the swimming pool is more approachable and it's not as far away. That's how this treatment can work. And I'm going to talk to you about 2 models that this treatment is based on. Before we get into that, I'm going to talk to you about a measuring system that we use. It's a feeling thermometer. We call it SUDS for short, not soap suds. It's SUDS because it's subjective, how you feel, units because you're measuring it, and you're measuring distress, how worried you might feel on a scale from 0, not worried at all, to 10, really worried or distressed. So you might think, What might your suds be if you're in your cozy pants on the couch, eating your favorite snack, watching your favorite show? Maybe around 0. What would your suds be if you had to sing the national anthem in front of a packed baseball stadium? Maybe 10. So you can see there's a range, right? So we use this feelings thermometer to think, what would your suds be in this situation? What would your suds be in this situation to make that ladder that I mentioned? And we'll also use it to explain an upcoming model. So there are 2 models that I'm using this treatment, and I'm going to explain the first one that was what we used previously to help inform the second one that we use now. All right, so the habituation model uses this graph where you got suds, that feeling thermometer that I mentioned, and time here. And so let's use an example where someone has difficulty going to school and they get to the school door and their suds are like a 6 out of 10. Now, what do they have the urge to do? Get out of there. So they run home. What happens to their suds? They go down. Phew, thank goodness I did not go there, right? What happens the next day when they get to that school door? Higher, lower, or the same? If you said higher, you're likely right. And because why? And it's because that brain thinks, oh, it really is a scary place. So what do you have an urge to do? Get out of there. Run for the hills, go home. And what happens to the suds? Go down. Right, you can say go there. And then the next day, higher and higher and higher, and becomes this vicious cycle. And we realize school really does become a scary place because you're behind in your work, because they be asking you where you've been. And it's an extra challenging situation now with the avoidance. So let's try a different approach. Say a person gets to the school door, their suds are 6, and they stay. What do you think would happen? Eventually, it might be a bumpy road, a bumpy ride, but eventually suds do come down. Why? It's actually physically impossible to feel anxious forever. There are some thoughts and behaviors that can fuel that anxiety for some time. You can't stay anxious forever. And your brain learned that you did it, and so it will come down. And so that next day when you got to school, what do you think? Higher, lower, the same? Maybe lower, because you learned that you could do it, and it might even take less long to come down and less long to come down, less long to come down over time. But you don't get rid of anxiety altogether, and you might be thinking, why not? And that's because we need anxiety in manageable doses. It helps us prepare for the future. Before you cross the street, what do? You look both ways. If you didn't, that'd be bad news. You have a test the next day, what do? Study. If you did it, wouldn't do so well in school. So we need anxiety, we just need it in manageable doses, so it's not bossing us around. We need to keep it in check, and that's what this treatment will do. Now, exposure response prevention used to say the more you do exposures, gradually facing your fears, the lower your suds go over time. That might happen. The thing is, what we've learned is that actually doesn't even need to happen for exposures to work. We now focus on this inhibitory learning model, and I'll explain what that means. There are 2 possible outcomes for exposures. Expectancy violation, that means it's either not as bad as you expected it to be, so you expected it to be bad and it wasn't as bad, so that violated what you expected it to be. And even if it was as hard as you expected it to be, or maybe your suds are even higher, if you did it, you learned that you could do it. And that's really key. So you didn't fail the exposure if your suds were higher. If you did the exposure, that's a success. Now, how does this even work? Let me tell you. So every time you do something, like a behavior, your brain learns something. And you can think of it like a construction zone in the brain. And the neurons and the cells that talk to each other, they're like cars driving around in the brain. And every time your brain learns something, it paves cement on a new highway. So for someone who goes to the school and they're like, do not go in there, and they start avoiding, their brain is, well, that's a dangerous place. It paves cement on an avoid highway. So the neurons or the cars start driving on that highway more often. All's not lost though. So with exposure and response prevention, you put a do not enter sign on that highway, and you start teaching those neurons or cars, like, wait a second, that's not as bad as I thought it would be. You're like, okay, that was harder than I thought, but I learned that I can handle it. And you start paving cement on an approach highway. And the more that you do those exposures and teach your brain that you can do it, the more cement that gets paved on that approach highway, and the more those neurons drive on that highway. Now, here's the thing. Any behavior brain learns, you can't unlearn it, which means like the highways don't evaporate in the brain there. So what do I mean by that? On stressful, windy days, sometimes that do not enter sign gets knocked down and the neurons of the cars are like, what's over here? Oh, do not go to school. That is a scary place. Just said, all is not lost because you can't unlearn all those skills and previous brave experiences that you've had. With extra practice and exposures, you can remind that brain, you put that do not enter sign back up, and you're like, wait a second, all right, it's not as bad as I expected it to be or even it was. I learned that I can do it. And then those neurons are like, oh yeah, and start driving on the approach highway. So I say this because it's a bumpy road bossing back that anxiety. And so sometimes if you find that some days are harder or kind of reminding you back where you started, you're not back at the start. You can put that do not enter sign back up and remind those cars to drive on that approach highway. If you do the exposure, that's a success, not necessarily what your sights were afterward. Learning that you can do it is the most powerful experience yet. All right, so we were talking about CBT with ERP, cognitive behavioral therapy with exposure and response prevention. Let's talk about some other support options. Medication can be an option too. One example is a type of class medication called selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. And I like to think of those as, think about for an analogy as professional basketball players, right? They have to practice to keep up their skills. So the practice is like CBT. They don't practice barefoot though. They wear basketball shoes. And you can think of the basketball shoes, they give those players a boost. Those basketball shoes can be like the medication. So some people find that having medication in addition to the CBT gives them that boost to really help boss back their anxiety. There also are books out there. I mentioned the book that I wrote. That's not the only one out there. ADAA has a list of other resources for you. Books can be found in the library, wherever you might get your books. Some people find that they prefer to read about this information from the comfort of their home to kind of get started. It doesn't replace therapy necessarily, but can get your feet wet and give you some examples of what it might look like, or you can also use it to support your treatment with a mental health clinician if you decide to work with one. So how do you get connected with a provider? Your family can talk to your pediatrician and get some referrals so you can sit meeting with someone. And social anxiety can be really challenging. Know that there's treatment that can help. You're not alone. And you can get back to doing what's important to you. I've seen it. It's really inspiring. You've got this. Thank you for listening to this webinar.